July 6, 2022. Police were called to a home in Norton Shores, Michigan. A 15-year-old boy was dead. When officers arrived, they found him in the garage. His body was ice cold, covered in bruises, severely malnourished. What they initially thought was a tragic death would quickly reveal itself to be something far more sinister. Because Timothy Ferguson didn't just die. He was tortured, starved, frozen, by the person who was supposed to protect him most, his own mother, and she documented everything. If you believe the most vulnerable deserve protection and justice, please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Timothy Ferguson's case shows why we must never look away from abuse. Timothy Ferguson was born on May 5, 2007, in Michigan. He came into this world with challenges. He was autistic, had developmental delays, required extra care, extra patience, extra love. Timothy also had reactive attachment disorder, a condition that develops in children who don't form healthy attachments with caregivers early in life. He struggled with emotional regulation, with social interactions, with understanding the world around him. But despite his challenges, Timothy was a child, a boy who deserved care, who deserved compassion, who deserved a chance at life. His mother was Shanda Vander Ark. She was his primary caregiver, responsible for his well-being, for making sure he received proper care, proper education, proper medical attention. Shanda presented herself publicly as a devoted mother, a woman dealing with the challenges of raising a special needs child. She worked, managed her household, appeared normal to those who didn't look too closely. But behind closed doors, something very different was happening, something evil, something that would eventually lead to Timothy's death in the most horrific way imaginable. Shanda had a boyfriend named Paul Ferguson. Paul lived with Shanda and her children, including Timothy and his younger brother. Paul was involved in the household, in the children's lives, and he would become complicit in what happened to Timothy. As Timothy got older, his care became more challenging. His behavioral issues were difficult. His needs were complex. But instead of seeking proper help, instead of getting Timothy the services he needed, Shanda chose a different path. She began to punish Timothy, not normal discipline, not reasonable consequences for misbehavior, torture, systematic, deliberate torture disguised as discipline. It started with food restriction. Shanda would deny Timothy meals, would lock food away, would make him watch others eat while he starved. She claimed this was to control his behavior, to teach him lessons. But it was cruelty, pure cruelty. The food restriction escalated. Timothy was given smaller and smaller portions, sometimes nothing at all. His body began to waste away. He became painfully thin, malnourished. His growth was stunted. His health deteriorated. But Shanda didn't stop. She added new punishments, new methods of torture. She would force Timothy to take ice baths, not quick cold showers, extended periods in ice-cold water. She'd make him sit in a bathtub filled with ice water for hours. His body temperature would drop. He'd shake uncontrollably, plead for it to stop. She'd leave him there. She documented these ice baths, took videos, texted about them to Paul, described Timothy's suffering in casual, almost gleeful terms, like she enjoyed it, like his pain was entertainment. The abuse expanded to sleep deprivation. Shanda would keep Timothy awake for extended periods, prevent him from resting, from sleeping, would wake him up repeatedly. This, combined with starvation and cold exposure, was breaking down Timothy's body and mind. She also used a spray bottle filled with a mixture that burned Timothy's skin, would spray it in his face, in his eyes, on his body, cause him pain for minor infractions or for no reason at all. Timothy's younger brother witnessed much of this abuse, lived in the same house, saw what was happening. The terror he must have felt, knowing his mother was capable of this, is unimaginable. Shanda kept detailed records of her abuse, text messages to Paul describing what she was doing to Timothy, photos and videos of Timothy's suffering. She created a digital trail of evidence that would later damn her in court. In these messages, Shanda showed no remorse, no maternal instinct, no recognition that she was harming her child. Instead, she complained about Timothy, mocked him, described her punishments matter-of-factly, like she was discussing household chores. Paul responded to these messages, encouraged the abuse, suggested punishments, was an active participant even when he wasn't physically present. He knew what was happening. He approved. He helped. By 2022, Timothy was 15 years old, but he didn't look 15. He looked like a much younger child, severely underweight, underdeveloped. His body showed the effects of prolonged starvation and abuse. Timothy should have been in school, should have been receiving special education services, should have been monitored by the school system, but Shanda had pulled him from school, claimed she was homeschooling him. This removed outside oversight, removed people who might notice his condition, might report abuse. Without school personnel seeing Timothy regularly, without teachers or counselors checking in, Shanda had complete control. No one was watching. No one was protecting Timothy. The abuse intensified in the months before Timothy's death. The ice baths became more frequent, the starvation more severe, the punishments more cruel. Timothy was forced to stand in the cold garage for hours. In Michigan, in winter, wearing minimal clothing. His body couldn't regulate temperature properly due to malnutrition. He'd freeze, shake, beg to come inside. Shanda would leave him there. She also made Timothy do excessive physical exercises while malnourished and weak. Would force him to do jumping jacks, push-ups, other activities his starved body couldn't handle. When he couldn't complete them, she'd punish him more. Timothy was living in hell, in his own home, at the hands of his own mother. Every day was torture. Every day was survival. And no one was coming to save him. In early July 2022, Timothy's condition was critical. His body was shutting down. The months of starvation, cold exposure, and abuse had taken their toll. He was dying, and Shanda knew it. On July 5, 2022, Shanda subjected Timothy to another ice bath. This one lasted hours. Timothy was in the tub in ice-cold water for an extended period. His body temperature dropped dangerously low. He was hypothermic, suffering, dying. After the ice bath, Timothy was moved to the garage. The cold garage, still wet, still freezing. His body couldn't recover, couldn't generate heat, couldn't survive. On July 6, 2022, Timothy Ferguson died. He was 15 years old. His body gave out. The torture had finally killed him. When Timothy died, Shanda called 911, reported that her son was unresponsive, acting panicked, playing the concerned mother. But the responding officers immediately knew something was wrong. Timothy's body was ice cold. He was emaciated, covered in bruises. His condition suggested prolonged abuse. This wasn't a sudden death. This was the result of systematic torture. The investigation began immediately, and what detectives discovered would shock even seasoned law enforcement. What they found on Shanda's phone would reveal the full extent of Timothy's suffering, and it would ensure that justice would be pursued with full force. When police arrived at Shanda Vander Ark's home on July 6, 2022, they found Timothy's body in the garage. The scene was disturbing. Timothy weighed only 69 pounds, 15 years old. 69 pounds. He should have weighed at least 100 to 120 pounds for his age and height. His body showed signs of severe malnutrition. His ribs were visible. His face was gaunt. His limbs were thin. He looked like a concentration camp victim. This wasn't a child who died suddenly. This was a child who'd been starved over an extended period. There were bruises on Timothy's body, old and new, various stages of healing, evidence of repeated trauma, evidence of ongoing abuse. Detectives immediately suspected abuse, began investigating, interviewed Shanda, interviewed Paul Ferguson, started piecing together what had happened. Shanda told investigators that Timothy had behavioral issues, that he was difficult to manage, that she'd been trying her best, that his death was unexpected, that she didn't know what happened. Paul told a similar story, said Timothy had problems, said Shanda was doing her best, claimed they'd tried to help him, but detectives weren't buying it. Timothy's condition told a different story. They obtained search warrants for the house, for Shanda's phone, for Paul's phone, for any evidence that might explain how Timothy died. What they found on those phones was horrifying. Shanda had documented everything, had created a record of abuse that would serve as evidence of her crimes. There were text messages between Shanda and Paul spanning months. Messages describing punishments, describing ice baths, describing Timothy's suffering. The messages were casual, matter of fact, showed no concern for Timothy's well-being. In one text, Shanda described making Timothy take an ice bath, said he was shaking, said he was begging to get out, said she made him stay in longer. Paul responded with encouragement, told her she was doing the right thing. In another text, Shanda complained about Timothy eating food he wasn't supposed to have, described how she was going to punish him. Paul suggested withholding meals, suggested making Timothy earn food through compliance. There were videos on Shanda's phone, videos of Timothy in ice baths, videos of him shaking, crying, begging for mercy. Shanda had filmed his torture, had kept these videos on her phone, like trophies, like proof of her power over her helpless son. Detectives watched these videos. Hardened investigators who'd seen terrible things in their careers were brought to tears. The cruelty was beyond comprehension. This was a mother torturing her autistic son, documenting it, sharing it with her boyfriend. The messages and videos showed premeditation, showed that the abuse was deliberate, systematic, not impulsive anger or loss of control. Planned torture. Detectives also found Shanda's notes. She'd kept written records of Timothy's punishments, listed what he'd done wrong, what consequences she'd imposed, how long he'd been in ice baths, how many meals he'd been denied. She'd tracked his torture like a project. The autopsy was conducted by the Kent County Medical Examiner. The findings confirmed what was obvious from looking at Timothy's body. He died from hypothermia compounded by severe malnutrition. The prolonged exposure to ice-cold water had lowered his body temperature to a point where his organs couldn't function. His malnourished body couldn't generate heat, couldn't recover. He'd literally frozen to death. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death as homicide. Timothy Ferguson was murdered, tortured to death by his mother over an extended period. Additional medical findings showed Timothy had old injuries, healed fractures, scars, evidence of long-term abuse. This hadn't just started recently. Timothy had been suffering for a long time. On July 7, 2022, one day after Timothy's death, Shanda Vander Ark was arrested. She was charged with felony murder and first-degree child abuse. She was taken into custody, held without bond. Paul Ferguson was arrested shortly after. He was charged with first-degree child abuse. While he hadn't inflicted all the abuse himself, he'd been aware of it, had encouraged it, had been complicit. He was responsible too. Both pleaded not guilty. Both hired attorneys. Both prepared to fight the charges. Timothy's younger brother was removed from Shanda's custody immediately, placed in protective care. He'd witnessed his brother's torture, had lived in fear. He needed safety, therapy, help processing what he'd experienced. Interviews with the younger brother revealed more details. He described watching Timothy being punished, described the ice baths, the starvation, the cruelty. He'd been too young and too scared to stop it, had lived in terror that he'd be next. The community in Norton Shores was horrified. News of Timothy's death spread. People couldn't believe a mother could do this to her child, couldn't understand how this had happened in their community without anyone knowing. Neighbors were interviewed. Some said they rarely saw Timothy, thought maybe he was staying with other family, didn't realize he was being kept hidden in the house, didn't know he was suffering. Others said they'd seen Shanda, thought she seemed like a normal parent, never suspected abuse. She'd hidden it well, had maintained a facade of normalcy while torturing her son. The school district was questioned. Why wasn't Timothy in school? Why wasn't he being monitored? They explained that Shanda had claimed to be homeschooling him, that Michigan law allowed this, that they had no authority to check on homeschool children unless specific concerns were reported. This highlighted a gap in child protection. Homeschooling can be legitimate, but it can also be used to hide abuse, to isolate children from mandatory reporters like teachers, to prevent anyone from seeing a child's condition. Timothy's case showed this vulnerability. Child Protective Services reviewed their records. They'd had contact with the family before. There had been reports, concerns raised, but CPS had investigated and closed cases, had believed Shanda's explanations, had missed the severity of the abuse. This is tragically common. CPS is overwhelmed, underfunded, has too many cases and too few workers. Sometimes things slip through. Sometimes children die. Timothy was another victim of a system that couldn't protect him. As the investigation continued, more evidence emerged. Financial records showed Shanda was receiving government benefits for Timothy's care. Money meant to help with his special needs. She was being paid to care for him, while torturing him, while starving him. The hypocrisy was stunning. Medical records showed Timothy had previously received services, had been in programs for children with special needs. But Shanda had pulled him from these services, had isolated him, had cut off access to professionals who might have noticed abuse. The prosecution began building their case. They had overwhelming evidence. The text messages, the videos, the photos, the autopsy, the medical expert testimony. They were confident they could prove murder. But they knew this case would be difficult for a jury. If you believe the most vulnerable deserve protection and justice, please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Timothy Ferguson's case shows why we must never look away from abuse. The details were horrific. Watching videos of Timothy's torture would traumatize people. Hearing about what he endured would be unbearable. But the jury needed to know, needed to see the truth of what Shanda had done. The trial was scheduled for 2023. Both Shanda and Paul would be tried separately. Shanda's trial would come first. She was the primary abuser, the mother who'd betrayed her most fundamental duty. As 2022 ended and 2023 began, preparations continued. The prosecution fine-tuned their case. The defense looked for any angle to create doubt. And the community waited for justice for Timothy. Shanda Vander Ark's trial began in September 2023 in Muskegon County, Michigan. The courtroom was packed. Media from across Michigan, true crime followers, community members demanding justice for Timothy. Judge Matthew Castle presided. This would be one of the most difficult trials he'd ever oversee. The evidence was disturbing, the details horrific, but justice required the truth be told. The prosecution was led by Assistant Prosecutor Gregory Haver. His job was to prove Shanda murdered Timothy through torture and neglect, to show the jury exactly what she'd done, to get justice. The defense was led by Fred Johnson. His job was to defend Shanda, to create doubt if possible, to minimize her culpability, to save her from the harshest punishment. It was a nearly impossible task given the evidence. Jury selection took time. Finding people who could handle the graphic evidence was challenging. Finding people who could be impartial after hearing what this case involved was difficult. But eventually a jury was seated. Opening statements began. Prosecutor Haver addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a mother who tortured her autistic son to death. For months, Shanda Vander Ark subjected Timothy Ferguson to ice baths, starvation, and abuse. She documented it, filmed it, texted about it, and on July 5th and 6th, 2022, she killed him, put him in an ice bath until he was hypothermic, left him in a freezing garage to die. Timothy weighed 69 pounds. He was 15 years old. That didn't happen overnight. That was months of deliberate starvation, months of torture, and the evidence will prove Shanda Vander Ark is responsible. The defense's opening was different. Johnson tried to create sympathy, tried to explain Shanda's actions. Shanda Vander Ark was a mother trying to care for a very difficult child. Timothy had severe behavioral issues, reactive attachment disorder. He was violent, destructive. Shanda was overwhelmed. She made mistakes, bad decisions. But she didn't murder her son. She didn't intend for him to die. This is a tragedy. But it's not murder. The prosecution began presenting evidence. They called medical examiners who testified about Timothy's condition, about his weight, about his malnutrition, about the cause of death. They showed photos of Timothy's body. The jury gasped. Some looked away. Others cried. Timothy looked like a skeleton. His ribs protruded. His face was hollow. His body showed the effects of prolonged starvation. The medical examiner explained that to reach 69 pounds at age 15, Timothy must have been denied adequate food for months. This wasn't a sudden weight loss. This was systematic starvation. They explained hypothermia, how Timothy's body temperature had dropped so low his organs shut down, how the ice bath combined with his weakened state from malnutrition killed him, how he'd suffered immensely before dying. Then came the most difficult part of the trial. The text messages and videos. The prosecution had to show the jury what Shanda had done, had to make them see Timothy's suffering. They displayed text messages on screens in the courtroom. Messages between Shanda and Paul describing punishments, describing ice baths. The jury read them. Some jurors cried. Others looked angry. The casual tone of the messages was chilling. In one text, Shanda wrote, "He's in the tub." Paul responded, "Good." She wrote, "He's shaking." Paul, "He'll learn." This exchange was about a 15-year-old boy sitting in ice water, being tortured. Then the videos were played. This was the hardest part. The jury had to watch videos of Timothy in ice baths, shaking, crying, begging to get out. In one video, Timothy was in a bathtub filled with ice and water. His body was shaking violently. He was saying please over and over. Shanda's voice could be heard telling him to be quiet. The video was several minutes long. Timothy's suffering was clear. Jurors wept. The judge had to take breaks. The courtroom was silent except for crying. Even hardened court staff were affected. This was beyond anything most had ever seen. The prosecution played multiple videos. Each one showed Timothy in distress. Each one showed Shanda's cruelty. The evidence was overwhelming. Shanda sat at the defense table watching these videos. Her own videos. Her own cruelty on display. She showed little emotion. Didn't cry. Didn't look remorseful. Just watched. This lack of emotion was noted by everyone in the courtroom. The prosecution called Timothy's younger brother to testify. He was nervous, scared, but he told the truth. Described watching Timothy being punished. Described the ice baths, the starvation, the abuse. He said Timothy was always cold, always hungry, always scared. Said Shanda would lock the food cabinets so Timothy couldn't eat. Said she'd make Timothy sleep in the garage sometimes in winter. The younger brother's testimony was devastating. This was a child describing witnessing his siblings' torture. The jury listened intently. Many were crying. The defense cross-examined but gently. They couldn't attack a child witness. Couldn't make him look bad. They just tried to suggest he might not remember everything correctly. But his testimony stood. Forensic experts testified about the evidence from Shanda's phone. Showed the full extent of the text messages. The planning. The deliberateness. The premeditation. They showed that Shanda had researched child punishment online. Had looked up how to control difficult children. The searches suggested she was looking for methods to use on Timothy. CPS workers testified about their previous interactions with the family. Admitted they'd missed signs. Admitted the system had failed Timothy. It was painful testimony. They hadn't protected him. School officials testified that Timothy had been withdrawn from school. That they'd had no contact with him for an extended period. That Shanda had claimed homeschooling. That they had no authority to check on him. All of this evidence built a picture. A picture of Timothy isolated, abused, tortured, with no one to help him, no one to save him, trapped with a mother who saw him as a problem to be punished rather than a child to be loved. The prosecution rested after days of testimony. They'd proven their case, shown the jury exactly what happened. The evidence was overwhelming. Now the defense had to present their case, had to try to save Shanda from a murder conviction. But what could they possibly say? The defense called their witnesses, mental health experts who evaluated Shanda, experts who testified about reactive attachment disorder, about how difficult children with this condition can be to parent. They tried to paint a picture of Shanda as overwhelmed, as a mother who didn't know what to do, who made terrible choices but didn't intend to kill her son. One psychologist testified that children with reactive attachment disorder can be extremely challenging, can be manipulative, can push parents to their breaking point. This was meant to create sympathy for Shanda. But the prosecution dismantled this on cross-examination. Even if Timothy was difficult, does that justify ice baths? Does that justify starvation? Does that justify torture? No expert could justify what Shanda did. The defense also tried to blame Paul Ferguson, suggested he was the driving force behind the abuse, that Shanda was following his instructions, that she was afraid of him, but the text messages didn't support this. Shanda initiated many of the punishments, described them to Paul, wasn't being forced, was an active, willing participant. The attempt to shift blame failed. The defense did not call Shanda to testify. This was strategic. If she testified, the prosecution would destroy her on cross-examination, would force her to explain the videos, the texts, the cruelty. Better to stay silent. After just a few days, the defense rested. Their case was weak. They had nothing to counter the overwhelming evidence. All they could do was hope the jury would somehow find doubt. Closing arguments came in late September 2023. Prosecutor Haver stood before the jury for the final time. Shanda Vander Ark tortured her son to death. You've seen the evidence. The videos of Timothy shaking in ice water. The texts describing his suffering. The photos of his emaciated body. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mother who lost control. This was systematic torture over months. Shanda starved Timothy, froze him, documented his pain, and when he died, she called 911 pretending to be a concerned mother. She's guilty of murder, and you must hold her accountable. Haver showed the jury photos of Timothy one final time, alive in earlier photos, smiling, then the photos from after death. The contrast was stark. What Shanda had done to him was undeniable. Defense Attorney Johnson delivered his closing. He tried one last time to create doubt. Yes, Shanda made terrible decisions. Yes, Timothy's death is a tragedy. But murder requires intent to kill. The prosecution hasn't proven Shanda intended for Timothy to die. She was trying to discipline a difficult child. She went too far. Way too far. But that's not murder. That's a parent who made catastrophic mistakes. You can convict her of child abuse, but not murder. But his argument felt hollow. The jury had seen too much. The evidence was too clear. The cruelty was too obvious. The jury began deliberating on September 26, 2023. They had hours of evidence to review. Terrible evidence. Evidence that would haunt them. They deliberated for about a day. Reviewed the videos, the texts, the photos, discussed the law, discussed what constitutes murder. On September 27, 2023, the jury reached a verdict. Everyone returned to the courtroom. Shanda was brought in. The tension was palpable. Judge Castle asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood. "We have, Your Honor." The verdict was read. Count 1, felony murder. We the jury find the defendant, Shanda Vander Ark, guilty. Count 2, first-degree child abuse. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. The jury had convicted her, had held her accountable for murdering Timothy. There were gasps in the courtroom. Some people cried in relief. Justice for Timothy. Finally, Shanda showed little reaction, just stared ahead. No tears, no emotion. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Shanda would never be free, would spend the rest of her life in prison for what she did to her son. Sentencing was scheduled for January 2024. This was when the judge would formally impose the sentence, when victim impact statements would be heard, when Shanda would learn her fate. In the months between conviction and sentencing, Paul Ferguson's case proceeded. He'd been charged with first-degree child abuse. He'd been complicit in Timothy's torture, encouraged it, participated in it. Paul decided not to go to trial. The evidence against him was strong. The text showing his involvement, his encouragement of Shanda's abuse. He'd face a jury that just convicted Shanda. His chances weren't good. In December 2023, Paul Ferguson pleaded no contest to second-degree child abuse. This was a plea deal, lesser charge in exchange for avoiding trial. He'd still face significant prison time but not life. His sentencing was scheduled for early 2024 as well. He'd be held accountable, not to the same degree as Shanda, but he wouldn't walk free either. On January 30th, 2024, Shanda Vander Ark returned to court for sentencing. The courtroom was full. People wanted to see justice served, wanted to witness Shanda receive her sentence. Timothy's family members spoke. Extended family, people who'd loved Timothy, who'd wanted to help him but hadn't known the extent of his suffering. One family member said, "Timothy was a child, an innocent boy who needed help, who needed love. Instead, he got torture. He got a mother who saw him as a burden, who killed him. Shanda Vander Ark is a monster, and she deserves to spend the rest of her life in prison." Another said, "Timothy suffered every single day. He was cold, hungry, in pain, scared, and his mother did that to him. The person who should have protected him will never forgive her. Never." The prosecutor addressed the court, reiterated the heinous nature of Shanda's crimes, the premeditation, the cruelty, the complete lack of remorse. The defense asked for mercy, asked the judge to consider that Shanda had no prior criminal record, that she'd been overwhelmed, that she needed mental health treatment, not just punishment. Judge Castle addressed Shanda directly. "Ms. Vander Ark, you were convicted by a jury of murdering your son Timothy through torture and neglect. The evidence showed systematic abuse, ice baths, starvation, cruelty beyond comprehension. Timothy was 15 years old and weighed 69 pounds when he died. You did that to him. You documented it. You showed no remorse. For the crime of felony murder, the sentence is mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will never be released. You will die in prison. And that is appropriate given what you did to your son. Life without parole. Shanda Vander Ark would spend the rest of her life behind bars, would never know freedom again, would grow old in prison, would die there. She was led out of the courtroom, back to jail, to be transferred to the Michigan Department of Corrections, to begin her life sentence. The community felt a sense of justice. Timothy couldn't be brought back, but his killer was punished, would never harm another child. That had to be enough. If you believe the most vulnerable deserve protection and justice, please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Timothy Ferguson's case shows why we must never look away from abuse. In February 2024, Paul Ferguson was sentenced. He'd pleaded no contest to second-degree child abuse. The judge had discretion on his sentence within statutory limits. The prosecution argued Paul deserved the maximum. He'd encouraged Shanda's abuse, had been aware of Timothy's suffering, had done nothing to stop it, had been complicit in torture. The defense argued Paul wasn't the primary abuser, wasn't the one inflicting the worst abuse, that he'd been influenced by Shanda, that he deserved a chance at eventual release. Judge Castle sentenced Paul Ferguson to 50 to 100 years in prison. Technically not life without parole. But Paul was in his 40s. He'd likely die in prison. He'd be eligible for parole at 90 years old if he lived that long. The sentence reflected his culpability. He hadn't killed Timothy directly, but he'd enabled it, encouraged it, failed to protect a vulnerable child he lived with. He deserved decades in prison. Both Shanda and Paul were now serving their sentences in Michigan prisons, separated, never to see each other again, both paying for what they did to Timothy. The aftermath of the case brought important questions. How did this happen? How did Timothy suffer for months without anyone knowing? Without anyone intervening? The homeschool issue became a major focus. Shanda had pulled Timothy from public school, claimed she was homeschooling him. This removed him from mandatory reporters, from teachers who might notice abuse. Michigan law, like many states, doesn't require extensive oversight of homeschooling. Parents can withdraw children from school with minimal requirements. No regular check-ins, no testing, no home visits in most cases. This creates vulnerability. Most homeschooling is legitimate, parents providing quality education at home. But it can also be used to hide abuse, to isolate children, to prevent anyone from seeing their condition. Timothy's case sparked debate about homeschool regulations. Should there be more oversight, regular check-ins, testing to ensure children are actually being educated, wellness checks to ensure they're not being abused? Advocates for homeschooling argued that more regulation would burden legitimate homeschooling families, that the vast majority of homeschoolers are providing excellent education, that a few bad cases shouldn't result in onerous requirements for everyone. Child protection advocates argued that children's safety must be the priority, that some oversight is necessary, that children shouldn't be invisible to systems meant to protect them. The debate continues. Some states have proposed Timothy's Law or similar legislation requiring more homeschool oversight. Some have passed reforms. Others haven't. The balance between parental rights and child protection remains contested. The CPS failures were also examined. Child Protective Services had previous contact with the family, had investigated reports, had closed cases, had missed the severity of Timothy's abuse. This is tragically common. CPS is overwhelmed, underfunded. Workers have massive caseloads. They can't do thorough investigations of every case. Sometimes things are missed. Sometimes children die. After Timothy's death, CPS reviewed their protocols, made changes, tried to learn from what went wrong. But systemic issues remain. Without more funding, more workers, more resources, CPS will continue to struggle to protect every child. The medical system was questioned too. Timothy had previously received medical care, had been seen by doctors, but after being pulled from services, he had no medical oversight. No one monitoring his health. No one noticing his weight loss. Some argued there should be requirements for children with special needs to have regular medical checkups, even if homeschooled, to ensure they're healthy, being properly cared for. But again, implementation is challenging. The case highlighted how vulnerable special needs children are. They often can't advocate for themselves, can't report abuse, depend entirely on caregivers. When those caregivers are abusive, these children have no protection. Timothy had autism and reactive attachment disorder. He struggled to communicate, to form relationships, to trust. This made him particularly vulnerable to Shanda's abuse. He couldn't tell anyone, couldn't get help. Advocates for disabled children used Timothy's case to push for better protections, for more services, for more oversight, for ensuring special needs children aren't isolated from systems that could help them. The community in Norton Shores struggled with the knowledge that this happened in their town, that a child was tortured to death while they went about their daily lives, that they'd been neighbors to a monster. Some felt guilt, wondered if they should have seen signs, should have reported suspicions, should have done something, but Shanda had hidden it well, had maintained appearances. Most neighbors never saw Timothy, didn't know he existed. A memorial was established for Timothy. Community members gathered to remember him, to honor his life, to acknowledge the suffering he endured, to promise to do better protecting vulnerable children. Timothy's younger brother received therapy, intensive therapy to help him process what he'd witnessed. what he'd experienced, the trauma of watching his brother be tortured, the fear he'd lived with. He was placed with family members who could provide proper care, who could help him heal, who could give him the childhood he deserved, a childhood free from abuse and fear. The trial footage was widely shared online. The videos of Timothy's torture were played in court. Some news outlets and true crime channels showed edited versions. The public reaction was intense. People were outraged, horrified, couldn't comprehend how a mother could do this. The case became national news. Discussions on talk shows, analysis by legal experts, coverage by true crime media. Shanda Vander Ark became one of the most hated people in America, right alongside Casey Anthony and other notorious child killers. Her name became synonymous with evil, with the worst of humanity. In prison, Shanda was placed in protective custody. Other inmates knew what she'd done, knew she'd tortured her autistic son. Child abusers are despised in prison. She'd be in danger in general population. She filed an appeal of her conviction, argued ineffective counsel, argued the trial was unfair. All standard post-conviction motions. Legal experts believed her appeal had no merit. The evidence was too overwhelming. The verdict too sound. Paul Ferguson also filed appeals, also claimed various trial errors, also unlikely to succeed. Both would likely spend the rest of their lives in prison. The case joined the ranks of the worst child abuse cases in American history. Gabriel Fernandez, Harmony Montgomery, Adrian Jones, Timothy Ferguson. Names that represent failed systems, vulnerable children, adults who betrayed their most fundamental duty. The Timothy Ferguson case forced uncomfortable conversations about what we owe children, about when the state should intervene in families, about the limits of parental rights. Parents have broad rights to raise children as they see fit, to make decisions about education, religion, discipline. The law presumes parents act in children's best interests, gives them deference, respects family autonomy. But what happens when parents abuse this trust? When they harm rather than help? When parental rights conflict with children's safety? Timothy's case illustrated this tension. Shanda had the right to homeschool Timothy, had the right to withdraw him from public school, had the right to make decisions about his care. The state didn't intervene until it was too late, until Timothy was dead. Could the state have intervened earlier? Should homeschool students be required to have regular check-ins? Should CPS have more power to investigate? Should there be mandatory home visits for special needs children? These questions don't have easy answers. More intervention means more government intrusion into families, means more children unnecessarily removed from homes, means burdening good parents with requirements because of bad parents. But less intervention means more children like Timothy fall through cracks, means more vulnerable kids suffer unseen, means relying on luck and chance to protect children. Society struggles with this balance, wants to protect children, also wants to protect parental rights and family privacy. Timothy's case pushed people to question where the line should be. Some states responded with legislation, proposed laws requiring homeschool students to have annual wellness checks, required periodic testing or portfolio reviews, required children to be seen by medical professionals at least annually. Other states resisted such measures, argued they were reactionary, argued they'd burden families without preventing abuse, argued that abusers would find ways around requirements anyway. The homeschooling community was divided. Some homeschoolers supported reasonable oversight, agreed that children's safety must come first, were willing to accept some requirements to prevent another Timothy. Others saw any regulation as government overreach, as punishment for the crimes of a few, as threats to their freedom to educate children as they chose. The debate became contentious. What's clear is that the current system failed Timothy. He was invisible, withdrawn from school, no medical oversight, no check-ins, no one monitoring his well-being. Shanda could torture him without anyone knowing. That's a systemic failure. The case also highlighted the challenges of prosecuting child abuse. Even with overwhelming evidence, Even with videos of abuse, securing convictions can be difficult. Defense attorneys argue parents were overwhelmed, that punishments went too far but weren't criminal, that there was no intent to kill. Juries must decide, where's the line between harsh discipline and abuse? Between abuse and murder? Between a parent making terrible choices and a parent committing crimes? Timothy's case was clear, but many cases aren't. Prosecutors learned from this trial, learned the power of digital evidence. The text messages and videos were devastating. They proved premeditation, proved intent, proved systematic abuse. Without them, conviction might have been harder. This has implications for other cases. Prosecutors now aggressively seek digital evidence. Phone records, social media, cloud storage, because abusers often document their crimes, often share them with partners or friends, often create evidence of their guilt. The case also showed the importance of medical examiners. Doctor testimony about hypothermia and malnutrition was crucial, explained how Timothy died, proved it was homicide, not accident. Medical expertise is essential in abuse cases. Mental health professionals discussed what could drive a mother to torture her child. Shanda likely had personality disorders, lacked empathy, saw Timothy as a problem rather than a person. But mental illness doesn't excuse her actions, doesn't justify what she did. The involvement of Paul Ferguson showed how abuse can be enabled. Paul wasn't the primary torturer, but he encouraged Shanda, suggested punishments, knew what was happening. His complicity made him guilty too. This is important for other cases. Partners who know about abuse and don't stop it can be charged, should be charged. Bystanders to child abuse have a duty to protect, to report, to intervene. Paul's conviction sends that message. The public's reaction to the case showed how deeply child abuse affects people. Millions watched the trial, followed updates, were traumatized by the evidence, demanded justice, cried for a boy they'd never met. This collective trauma is real. True crime consumption has psychological effects, especially cases involving children. People struggle with the knowledge that such evil exists, that parents can harm their own children this way. Mental health professionals advised people to limit exposure to disturbing content, to take breaks, to process emotions. The Timothy Ferguson trial was particularly difficult. Many who watched struggled, but there's also value in bearing witness, in knowing what happened, in ensuring Timothy's suffering wasn't invisible, that people saw, people cared, people demanded change. That matters. The case will be studied in law schools, in social work programs, in child protection courses, used to teach about system failures, about recognizing abuse, about the importance of oversight. Timothy's death, while tragic, can help educate future professionals. Advocacy groups use Timothy's case in their work to lobby for stronger protections, better funding for CPS, more resources for special needs families, reform of homeschool laws. Timothy's name became attached to reform efforts. Whether these efforts succeed remains to be seen. Change is slow. Systems are entrenched, but pressure builds. Cases like Timothy's create momentum, create political will, create possibility for change. If you believe the most vulnerable deserve protection and justice, please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Timothy Ferguson's case shows why we must never look away from abuse. One of the most painful aspects of Timothy's case was how preventable it was. At multiple points, the system had opportunities to save him, and at each point, it failed. When CPS investigated previous reports, they could have dug deeper, could have insisted on seeing Timothy, could have been more skeptical of Shanda's explanations. But they were overwhelmed, undertrained, overworked. They missed it. When Timothy was withdrawn from school, the school could have followed up, could have required proof of educational progress, could have insisted on wellness checks. But the law didn't require it. They had no authority. They let him go. When medical professionals last saw Timothy, they could have flagged concerns about his care, could have made reports, could have demanded follow-up appointments. But once Timothy was pulled from services, they lost contact. Had no way to monitor him. When neighbors saw Shanda, when they interacted with her, they could have asked about Timothy, could have wondered where he was, could have reported concerns. But they didn't notice, didn't think to ask, didn't want to intrude. None of these individual failures alone killed Timothy. But collectively, they created the environment where Shanda could torture him undetected, where he had no advocates, no protection, no escape. This is the reality of child protection in America. It depends on multiple systems working together. Schools, medical providers, CPS, law enforcement, neighbors, community members. When any link breaks, children suffer. Strengthening these systems requires resources. More CPS workers with lower caseloads, better training, higher pay to attract qualified people, more funding for schools to follow up on withdrawn students, more medical outreach to at-risk families. It also requires cultural change. We need to be comfortable reporting suspicions, asking questions, being nosy when children's safety is at stake, preferring false alarms to missed abuse. The see something, say something principle applies to child protection. If something feels wrong, report it. Let professionals investigate. Better to be wrong than to stay silent while a child suffers. Timothy's case showed the dark side of privacy and autonomy. Shanda used her parental rights to isolate Timothy, used homeschooling to hide him, used the presumption that parents act in children's interests to continue abuse. The system trusted her until it was too late. This doesn't mean we should distrust all parents. Most parents love their children. Most act in their children's best interests. But we need systems that can identify the exceptions. The Shandas of the world. Before children die. Some proposed solutions include mandatory annual wellness visits for all children. Whether in school or homeschooled, a medical professional sees the child, checks their health, documents their well-being. This would prevent complete invisibility. Others suggest homeschool families should have to register annually, provide proof of educational progress, allow periodic home visits, not to judge curriculum, but to ensure children are safe and healthy. Critics argue these measures are invasive, that they assume guilt rather than innocence, that they burden good families because of bad ones, that they're un-American, authoritarian. The debate is legitimate. There are valid concerns on both sides. But Timothy's death argues for erring on the side of protection, for accepting some inconvenience if it saves even one child. The reality is that invisible children are at risk. When no one sees them, no one checks on them, no one knows they exist. Abusers have free rein. Systems can't protect what they can't see. Making every child visible, at least annually, to someone outside the family seems like a reasonable safeguard. It doesn't prevent all abuse, but it prevents complete isolation. Prevents cases like Timothy's where a child vanishes into a home and is tortured to death. The cost-benefit analysis favors protection. Yes, it's an inconvenience for families to have annual check-ins, but it's a small price compared to a child's life, compared to preventing torture, compared to ensuring every child has at least minimal oversight. Technology could help. Virtual check-ins, video calls where a child can be seen and spoken to, digital submission of work samples for homeschoolers, ways to verify children's well-being without requiring in-person visits for every family. But technology has limits. Skilled abusers can coach children, can create false appearances, can manipulate video calls. Nothing replaces in-person observation by trained professionals. But technology could supplement, could provide more frequent check-ins than would otherwise be possible. The special needs population deserves particular attention. Children with autism, developmental delays, communication challenges. They're especially vulnerable. Often can't report abuse, can't advocate for themselves, need extra protections. Timothy had autism, had reactive attachment disorder, struggled with communication, was perfect prey for an abusive parent. He couldn't tell anyone what was happening, couldn't seek help, was trapped, Special needs children should have mandatory ongoing services, regular contact with professionals, therapy, medical monitoring, educational support, not just for their development, but for their protection, so they're not invisible, so someone is watching. This requires funding. Services cost money, but the alternative is dead children, abused children, children suffering in silence. Society must decide if protecting vulnerable children is worth the investment. Timothy's case suggests it is. The horror of what he endured, the preventability of it, the systemic failures that allowed it, all argue for reform, for doing better, for ensuring no child suffers like Timothy again. Timothy Ferguson would have been 17 years old in 2025. He might have been in high school, learning a trade, exploring interests, receiving the support he needed to thrive despite his challenges, building a life, building a future. Instead, his life ended at 15, in a cold garage, after months of torture, after systematic abuse by the person who should have loved him most, his mother. Timothy never got to experience the things every child deserves, never got to feel safe in his own home, never got to have enough to eat, never got to be warm, never got to know what it feels like to be truly loved. His life was pain, was fear, was suffering. From the time Shanda began abusing him until the moment he died, Timothy knew only cruelty from his mother. That's a tragedy beyond words. What makes it worse is that Timothy was a child who needed extra help, extra compassion, extra patience. He was autistic, had developmental challenges, needed support. Instead, he got torture, got a mother who saw him as a burden, who solved the problem of Timothy by killing him. Shanda Vander Ark is in prison, will die there, will never know freedom, will spend decades behind bars for what she did. That's justice. That's accountability. But it doesn't bring Timothy back. Paul Ferguson is in prison, will likely die there too. His complicity, his encouragement of abuse, his failure to protect Timothy, all earned him decades behind bars. He deserves it. But Timothy is still dead. Justice for Shanda and Paul doesn't undo Timothy's suffering, doesn't give him back the life he deserved, doesn't heal the wounds he endured. It just ensures his killers pay. Timothy's younger brother is growing up without his sibling, carrying trauma from what he witnessed, getting help, getting therapy, but scarred by the knowledge that his mother tortured his brother to death. That's a wound that may never fully heal. The family members who loved Timothy carry guilt, wonder if they could have done more, could have noticed, could have saved him. They couldn't have known. Shanda hid it well, but the guilt persists. The professionals who had contact with Timothy's case carry regret. CPS workers who closed cases, teachers who didn't follow up when he was withdrawn, medical professionals who lost contact. All wonder what if they'd pushed harder, insisted on seeing Timothy, refused to accept Shanda's explanations. But blame is complex. The system failed. Multiple systems failed. No single person could have saved Timothy alone. It required all the pieces working together. And they didn't. The lesson from Timothy's case is that vulnerable children need protection, need visibility, need oversight. We can't allow children to become invisible. Can't allow parents to isolate kids from all monitoring. Can't trust that every parent acts in their child's best interest. Most parents do. Most parents love their children, would never harm them, would die to protect them. But some parents are monsters, like Shanda, and we need systems that can identify those parents, can protect children from them, before it's too late. Timothy's case calls us to do better, to strengthen CPS, to fund child protection, to create oversight for homeschool children, to ensure every child is seen by someone outside their family at least annually, to take seriously our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. Calls us to be willing to report concerns, to ask uncomfortable questions, to intervene when something seems wrong. Timothy suffered for months while neighbors went about their lives, while systems failed to notice, while no one saved him. We can't let that happen again. Can't let another Timothy die invisible. Die tortured. Die without anyone knowing or caring until it's too late. Rest in peace, Timothy Ferguson. You deserved a life. You deserved a mother who loved you. You deserved to be protected. You deserved to feel safe, warm, and fed. You deserved to grow up and discover who you could become. You got none of those things. You got torture. You got cruelty. You got a mother who saw you as a problem to eliminate rather than a child to cherish. You got a system that failed to protect you. But you are remembered. Your story is told. Your suffering is acknowledged. You mattered. Your life mattered. And your death must mean something. Must drive change. Must protect other vulnerable children. The images of you in those videos, shaking in ice water, crying, begging for mercy, those images haunt everyone who saw them. Remind us of the capacity for evil, of the reality of child abuse, of our duty to protect. You deserved so much better, Timothy. We all failed you. The systems failed you. The adults around you failed you. We're sorry. We're so sorry. May your case save other children. May the reforms it inspires prevent other mothers from doing what Shanda did. May your suffering not be in vain. Rest now. No more cold. No more hunger. No more pain. No more fear. You're free from her. Free from the torture. Free from the suffering. We won't forget you, Timothy Ferguson. We'll tell your story. We'll fight for change in your name. We'll honor your memory by protecting the children who remain. The vulnerable ones. The ones who need us to do better. Sleep peacefully. You deserved better from this world. But at least now, you're beyond anyone's ability to hurt you. If you believe the most vulnerable deserve protection and justice, please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next case.